day of the conference on the non-aligned movement. I will be chairing the panel on mobilities and migration, and I would like to welcome our lecturers and our speakers. I will start with Leonora Dugonic-Rodwin. Leonora holds a PhD in sociology, is currently working at the Department of Education of the Uppsala University, and her main interests, research interests, are international education policy studies. Then her talk today will be on the topic Destination Yugoslavia, the non-aligned trajectories of international students from 1960 to 1990. Then I would like to welcome David Hennig and Maple Rusher, who will together have a talk on New Borders, Old Solidarities, post-Cold War genealogies of mobility along the Balkan route. David is an associate professor of cultural anthropology at Utrecht University, and he was a visiting fellow at the Center for Southeast European Studies in Graz. His latest publication is Remaking Muslim Lives, Everyday Islam in Post-War Bosnia and Herzegovina, published 2020 by University of Illinois Press. And Maple Rusher, Associate Professor and Director of Global Studies at Colby College. His book, Bastards of Utopia, Living Radical Politics After Socialism, published by Indiana University in 2015, won the William Douglas Prize in Europeanist Anthropology. And his current research project is Insurgent Mobilities, an ethnography of refugee and activist struggles to enact freedom of movement in Europe. And our commentator today will be Catherine Baker. Catherine is the research coordinator for history and senior lecturer in 20th century history at Hull University. She's a specialist in post-Cold War history, international relations, and cultural studies, including the post-Yugoslav region in a transnational and global context. So, Leonora, the Zoom floor is yours. We have around about 15 minutes. Yeah?
Great.
Thank you.
So I'm gonna thank you, Paul, for organizing such an important conference. I'm going to share the screen. How is it?
Yes, once you press that thing you were going to press in the bottom left-hand corner, it'll be fine. Oh, now it's gone.
Should I first press that thing?
Now I don't see it on my screen anymore. Does anyone else see it?
Again.
No, I got it. I got it. I need to
share it again.
Press the thing on the top left corner. Yeah. All right. So what about now?
I see it, yeah.
Yeah, I can't get the presentation view. Do you have the presentation view?
No, but we can see it. You were pressing the right thing, but it doesn't seem to work. Try F5.
It's a Mac.
No.
Don't worry, it's very legible.
Yeah, the problem is I have graphs and everything.
Sorted.
But... Sorted? It's sorted? Yeah. Anyway, okay. So I take international students as a case for rescaling one of the key concepts of Bourdieu's field theory, capital. but I assume you are minimally familiar with it, but you won't need many elements of that. I won't develop that. It's just a bigger picture. I use it for understanding the drawbacks of something that has become like a conventional usage of this concept, especially in the sociology of elite education, which is my field. And it's taken as being something essentially cumulative and taking as something that's multiplying already existing national-based assets on an international, global level. But yeah, that's the big picture. In the concerning my research questions, this is not, yeah, my research questions the social significance of non-alignment on several levels of analysis. I use 3 different methods for gathering data. This is the macro level, where I use statistical methods. On the meso level, I use archives. And on the micro level, I use more ethnographic methods. In this case, here, 9 semi-directive interviews with people who were used to be international students in Yugoslavia. In this draft chapter, I provide an overview of the Yugoslav system of higher education, and I analyze the trajectories of international students based on these 9 interviews, which all lasted from about 1.5 hours to 2 hours. But in this presentation, I will focus on my findings, the flow of international students, the structure of these flows from other non-aligned member countries to Yugoslavia, and their individual trajectories. And I will delve a bit with you into the social characteristics of the respondents, why, and especially that question, why and how they came to Yugoslavia. This is, of course, not the only question that I address in those in-depth interviews that I conducted with them, but I focus on it for the sake of brevity and to make my main point here. So let's see what we get when we look at the flow of students. Sorry, I can't see my slides, so this was the information concerning the interviews. I have, they're anonymous, except for the ones who are super famous and that some of us will identify anyway, given the characteristics. And yeah, these were the interviews. So what happens? First, we need just a little snapshot of the context where these international students are coming, the larger context. So to give it, this slide provides that, you know, I mean, it can be summarized in the slides, and you can see here that in the context, it happens in a context of profound social transformations. Post-war Socialist Yugoslavia had experienced a dramatic growth in higher education. And just to illustrate that, you can see that the number of students more than doubled within 10 years, steadily rising from about 50,000 in 1951 to about 140,000 in 1960. And the number of schools and also faculties and universities grew significantly as well during the 1950s. Then when we look at the proportion of international students in Yugoslavia in that 10-year period, we can see that, and we need to keep that bigger picture in mind, because in the Yugoslav case, this proportion stays below 1% of the total student population for the whole period under study. Here I'm showing this 10-year period, but it's the case for the whole period until the 1990s. So this in itself is statistically insignificant, right? Not to mention when one compares this with countries such as France and Germany, where universities have a several centuries long tradition of welcoming international students. Yet these numbers have a heightened social significance in the Yugoslav context. And this is precisely why it's what makes them even more interesting, I think, for a sociologist who's dealing with different types of data like myself. Scholarship on international students in Yugoslavia was mainly historical, and it was mainly concerned with conditions of living and the perception of these international students by authorities and by the local population, and especially by Yugoslav students. And historians who specifically worked on this topic were reticent to analyze and compare the quantitative data that they had gathered in the archive. So the main point that I will make using these numbers is that between the end of the 1940s and the beginning of the 1960s, Yugoslavia clearly conducted a non-aligned policy in the sphere of international education. And I mean, this seems maybe to some of us as given, but I mean, when we look at the bulk of scholarship of Cold War historiography on non-aligned movement, this is significant because that historiography has been very much focused on the diplomatic and political sphere until all of us came along, basically, right? So when we look at the chronology, so just to briefly, what is the story that these numbers tell? Sorry, I'm going a bit fast here. The story is that between this chronology of influx of foreign students into Yugoslavia, and foreign students is a state administrative category that is used by these statistics. Like the whole structure and influx and evolution of it supports this point that I'm making. Because in the immediate post-war years, Yugoslavia was oriented towards the Soviet Union very much, as Dragomir Bonjic, the historian, has shown, and has implemented very much Soviet-style types of reforms and models, and which shaped cultural policy and even the organization of universities. And during these years, the largest number of international students came from neighboring countries such as Albania and Bulgaria. And then we have this international student population that changes radically after 1948, which is the emblematic date of the Yugoslav rupture with the USSR, when students from non-aligned nations of Africa, Asia, Middle East rapidly replaced those that used to come much more from North America and Europe. And when we look at international students by nationality, we see here that the proportion of non-European students surpasses very much that of European students already in 1961. And then more than half of foreign students were from outside Europe. And then after 62, already more than 2/3. Then we find also that European students have declined over the 10-year period here, to leave the space to students from outside Europe. So we have, like in 1955, 85% of these students, of international students, are from Europe, whereas in 1965, over 2/3 are from outside Europe. Then when we look at specifically the students that are coming from outside of Europe, we can find that international students, in counterpart, there's an important increase in African students specifically. Their proportion more than doubled in 1958, 1959, and again in 62. And their share consistently grew to over 1/3 in the subsequent years. So we can say, based on these statistics, these numbers, that the singularity of the student population in Yugoslavia during the 50s and the 60s here specifically is that the bulk of foreign students came from non-aligned countries. But as I said, they represented less than 1% of all students. Yet this heightens the significance of their presence in Yugoslavia, given the citizens' social imaginary, what Robertson calls Yugoslav third worldism, a sense of belonging to a larger community beyond national borders, and non-alignment, its effect on everyday life. Right? So this observation also is confirmed when we asked alumni why they came to study in Yugoslavia. So now I will present to you a little bit of the social characteristics of the respondents while I keep this slide so that you can see the main characteristics here. Basically, they come from a diversity of continents, regions, and countries. They share the following biographical characteristics. They're mainly Muslim by religion, which is not surprising given the most non-aligned nations were majority Muslim. They do not necessarily come from the respective capital cities of their countries. They went to Yugoslavia during the glorious 30s. They were born into families with a relatively large economic, cultural, and social capital in their countries of origin, and with more than 4 children also. They speak more than one of the world's most widely spoken languages, English, French, and Portuguese. And almost all of them, except Malik and Victor, received scholarships from the Yugoslav state. And most of them have settled in Belgrade, the capital of Serbia and of Socialist Yugoslavia. They arrived in Yugoslavia a few years after their homeland abolished colonial rule, some of whom Yugoslavia helped in the anti-colonial struggle. And it is precisely for this reason that all students from these countries wanted to come to Yugoslavia, and that obtaining a Yugoslav scholarship was at the same level as a Western scholarship. I quote here, sorry, I can't see that, but all students from these countries wanted to come to Yugoslavia. This is Ruben speaking. It was, I think I have a quote from him, right, there we go. It was difficult to obtain these scholarships, he says, even through nepotism, as Ruben recalls. He says that Yugoslav aid to Guinea-Bissau, which is his country of origin, in the liberation struggle against Portugal was so appreciated, and his reputation was so great that even the rural children, you know, illiterate rural children recognized who Tito was. And this is why studies in Yugoslavia were his priority, although for political reasons, he would have agreed to study in other countries as long as they were communist. The only alumni among our respondents who arrived in Yugoslavia 20 years after the liberation of his country was, and also reluctantly, is Abdel Malik. His case suggests that, that unlike the countries of the Soviet bloc, which mainly welcomed students through left-wing communist and nationalist political organizations, Yugoslavia was also open to anti-communist students. And then the experience of other former students confirms this observation. Mehdi recalls, for example, that within the association of Moroccan students, which included between 30 and 40 people, he says, there were often quarrels between communists, nationalists, and monarchists, which very much reflect the composition of political regimes included in the non-aligned movement. The same is true of Malik, who was involved in a Syrian Students Association at the time. So this political, I think it's interesting because it evokes that this political diversity in non-membership, such as geographic origin, country of origin, yeah, could sometimes even override other forms of affinity, such as religion. Or they came from fractions of dominant classes, yet perhaps not the uppermost in their country. And this is still, for me, under analysis. But this is my hypothesis. For example, Ruben's grandparents were among the most educated categories in Guinea-Bissau that were associated with the Portuguese colonizers. This led him, this led his father, as the director of a construction company, to have his own driver. Then you have Mehdi's parents offered him the opportunity to attend a high school that was reserved for the French exclusively. Victor's father worked as a biochemist and held a management position in a large oil company. Abdel Malik's grandfather was a prosperous merchant who owned several businesses, and his father was a goldsmith. Then Malik's father headed a Waqf of the Islamic community. And Steve's father was one of the leading figures of the independent Kenyan political scene. Even in colonial times, his grandparents were landowners. And Elias came from a family of university professors. So with the exception of Malik and Victor, who arrived in Yugoslavia without scholarships and whose studies were financed by their families, all the others benefited from scholarships as a result of the intervention of either parents, relatives, or acquaintances into the different state administrations of their countries. For example, Ruben benefited from the help of his uncle, Mehdi from an influential relative, Victor from a friend of his father, and so on and so forth. Without being questioned on this point, all respondents had emphasized the importance of this kind of help or connection. And with the exception of Steve, who came from Kenya at the age of 15 to attend secondary school in Yugoslavia, other respondents enrolled directly in universities, which is the more classic stories that we are familiar with. Steve seems to be much of an exception, but there seems to have been many other students who came in secondary school as well. I don't know what is their proportion. I haven't found that in statistics. But they all studied in different faculties. Ruben studied chemistry, Mehdi economics, Victor medicine, Abdel Malik forestry, Malik veterinary studies, Steve psychology, Elias food technology. And as the archives also show, the international students were granted scholarships to study technical and applied sciences, which is in line with the characteristics of their profiles in our sample. The only exception is Steve, who then went on to study psychology and then went on to build a musical career. But he's quite an exception. And he did arrive in Yugoslavia with a very strong wish of his parents wanting him to become a physician.
Leonor?
Yes.
I'm sorry, but I have to ask you to come slowly to the end because of our constantly time restrictions.
Absolutely. I'm sorry to have lost a bit of time at the beginning with Zoom screen sharing, but I'm at the end. Basically, I can wrap this up. I want to say that basically, the important point is that 4 of them had graduated while 3 did not. And those who have graduated from higher education, I mean, none of them managed to do so in less than 8 years, which is important because studies normally last 4 years. And in the case of medicine, 5 years. So this is for me, like an important point when it comes to like accumulating capital. I can develop that if you want, but I want to just go over like in conclusion, to wrap it up, all these respondents are coming from more petit bourgeois families with substantial economic and cultural assets. This is still a working hypothesis that needs to be developed in further analysis of these interviews and like reconstruction of, their immigration backgrounds back home and like the specific social context where they're coming from and social conditions. But this is the working hypothesis from the elements I've got here. And also that social capital is really key to obtaining a Yugoslav scholarships as an international student. And that a change of country implies a longer investment in time and studies, which kind of complicates this very common vision of capital as being something solely cumulative. Thank you for your attention, and sorry for going a little bit over time.
Thank you very much, Leonora. I would say now we can directly go to David and Maple. So David, Maple, floor is yours.
Thank you, Kruno, and
you're muted, Maple.
Sorry about that. I unmuted myself, but it switched back. Thanks. So yeah, thank you, Kruno and Paul for the organizational efforts, and Catherine in advance for her remarks. We are this is kind of a nice pivot from Leonora's talk to ours because she was focused on the wider world coming to Yugoslavia. We're going to shift to focusing on how non-alignment enabled Yugoslavs to travel into the wider world. An important historical dimension of non-aligned connectivities that has received relatively little attention is that of Yugoslav Muslim internationalism and solidarity forged during the Cold War. Yugoslavia's participation in NAM allowed Yugoslav Muslims to travel and communicate extensively with Muslims throughout non-aligned countries. The non-aligned world overlapped a great deal with a wider, as people have remarked in several contexts, it overlapped a great deal with a wider Islamic ecumen in the sense that it created as well as recreated once existing supralocal zones of interaction and imagination with shared points of reference across territorial and temporal scales, and where religious as well as political ideas circulated and were exchanged and cultivated, including those of solidarity and more than national modes of belonging. And during this period of global anti-colonial and anti-racist struggles and Cold War divides, these modes of belonging embodied both the Islamic as well as the geopolitical values of brotherhood, love, solidarity, and equality for Muslims of all walks of life, be it the example of El Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, aka Malcolm X, or Yugoslav Muslims such as those we discuss in our chapter.
So in our chapter, we consider two brief biographical sketches of Yugoslav Muslims in order to trace what Tanja Petrovic has described as affective histories of Yugoslav legacies. And we follow Petrovic in arguing in the chapter that these affective histories leave important sediments in contemporary life and have persistent consequences in the world. We specifically look at the role played by Yugoslav Muslims' personal experiences with Yugoslav NAM in influencing how they responded in solidarity with the refugees traveling the Balkan route, the majority of whom were coming from Muslim majority countries of Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, 3 states that were founding NAM members. The chapter then concludes with a reflection on whether this particular affective history of non-alignment provides us with lived categories of solidarity and offer a geohistorical category that continues to enable anti-colonial struggles and one that helps to challenge the dominant Eurocentric and Yugoslav-centric understanding of the non-aligned movement.
The Balkan route and the roots of solidarity. The so-called European migrant crisis, catalyzed by the opening of the Balkan route in 2015, 2016, has received widespread media and scholarly attention, and we won't rehearse that history for you now. We're going to assume you still remember those events. Elsewhere, we've dealt at length with the way the route intersected with a number of anti-nationalist traditions in the region, as well as with local histories of forced displacement. But it also intersected in important ways with the lived legacies of NAM. One example, as Catherine has highlighted in her book, includes fluent speakers of post-Yugoslav languages with heritage knowledge of Arabic, and their family history is often a product of NAM mobilities, and they were in particular demand as volunteer interpreters and activist translators during the period of the route. And this is correct, of course, but we want to show in our chapter how NAM enabled mobility didn't only bring Arabic speakers to Yugoslavia, but also sent Yugoslav Muslims into the Arabic-speaking world where they built lasting emotional ties. And the history of the 2015 migration crisis, as it was called, therefore needs to be understood also against the backdrop of these affective histories of non-aligned Yugoslavia that are still very much alive across the region.
Okay, so non-aligned solidarities against borders. So we begin with the story of Sajida, a young woman from Sarajevo who I met to learn about her childhood memories of growing up in Libya during the Cold War, where her father worked as an interpreter for a Yugoslav company. The biography of her father is characteristic of those Yugoslav Muslims who pursued their education and labor trajectories within the NAM realm abroad and became significant geopolitical and cultural mediators. Yugoslav companies pursuing business ventures across the Muslim majority non-aligned countries hired Yugoslav Muslims with knowledge of Arabic. Often after finishing his high school education at the madrasa in Sarajevo in the early 1970s, Sajida's father pursued further studies at a Libyan university and subsequently got a job with a Yugoslav company as an interpreter. Sajida and her other 2 siblings were born and grew up in Libya in the 80s. We document the memories of her childhood in our chapter in detail, and in particular the stories from her schooling in Libya. Sajida recalled pledging a daily oath of allegiance along with other children to Colonel Gaddafi and, to cite her, to the fight against imperialism, Zionism, and America, end of quote, because, as she puts it, you are trained to serve the revolution, end of quote. She also reminisced about watching TV programs for children, which were full of songs and poems about Gaddafi and other NAM leaders. When the family was living near Benghazi, the kids at the school, as well as their parents in the neighborhood where they lived at the time, came from various places in the Levant, as she puts it, referring to people coming from as far as Syria and Iraq. Living in this small non-aligned bubble, Sajida learned Arabic such that she was able to switch seamlessly between a variety of Arabic dialects, a skill that became handy during the migration crisis. When the Yugoslav wars broke out in the early 1990s, their life in Libya became complicated as the Yugoslav companies as well as the federation dissolved, and Sajida's family became stateless overnight. Eventually, the family returned in 1997 when she was 11. Leaving Libya, however, was traumatic. While Sajida and her siblings feel strongly attached to Bosnia, they also feel a strong attachment to the non-aligned Arab world where they grew up. After they return, she and her siblings kept Arabic as their secret language. These strong cultural ties and memories of life within the NAM realm still reverberated strongly in 2015 when the opening of the Balkan route prompted Sajida to act. When she first saw media images of exhausted refugees resting in public spaces of Belgrade, she was sitting in her office in Sarajevo. She knew immediately, she said, that she needed to help no matter how. She took a leave of absence from work and went to Belgrade to lend a hand, including through interpreting. Later, she traveled against the northward flow of the Balkan route, going to the Greek island of Lesbos. She volunteered in a medical center and interpreted from Arabic to English. Her childhood familiarity with various Arabic dialects became very handy on Lesbos, where Médecins Sans Frontières did not have enough interpreters at the time. Later, when Hungary and Croatia closed their borders, more and more people on the move started arriving to Bosnia, hoping to cross the EU border there, which led to another humanitarian crisis. Sajida responded to these developments again with the same energy and vigor, particularly in Sarajevo. With her friends, she started immediately organizing help, shelters, and food assistance for them. Whereas the authorities obstructed humanitarian aid, and many fellow citizens responded with apathy and increasingly over time, open hostility.
Sajida is not alone in drawing on earlier NAM experiences in the Arab world to inspire engagement in support of people on the move. Our second biographical sketch is drawn from an ongoing collaborative ethnographic project in which Nadia El-Sharaway and I have been documenting convergences between local activists and people on the move along the Balkan route. Here we draw on the experiences of an ethnically Albanian imam from the village of Miratovac in southern Serbia, with his mosque located only a few hundred meters from the Serbian border with North Macedonia, among a cluster of villages that became an important node for people on the move during 2015's long summer of migration. The imam played an important solidarity role along with other local activists. As the imam explained, quote, I have a long history with Syria. I did my theological training in the time of the non-aligned movement in Syria. I lived there for 8 years, learned Arabic, even experienced the first uprising against Assad in 1981, end quote. And he also added, I've stayed in touch with people in Syria, and I teach my community and other imams in the area, when possible, about the revolution against Assad, so that they understand why these refugees have to flee now and why we are encountering them in our little village, end quote. With pride, the imam described how he helped create a reception center for refugees in the late spring of 2015 with water and power connections from our mosque, and medical care provided by MSF. Once we had established a bit more trust with the imam, he disclosed that his solidarity actions actually began even earlier and were more extensive than he had first led on. Quote, I welcomed refugees for more than a year before the trickle swept to a river in the summer of 2015. When the numbers grew to more than we could accommodate in the mosque, we would disperse people to various houses in Miratovac. There was never difficulty finding a place for them in local homes. More than half of our people are abroad, almost all working in Switzerland. And one of the local activists who had first introduced us to the imam sort of encouraged him to speak further about some of his activities. And he eventually also told us that he had helped to build a gravel road so that refugees would not need to cross the muddy fields from North Macedonia to Serbia when the weather turned rainy. And so we sort of incredulously asked him, so you built the road, an international road, on your own? And he said, quote, yes, but this is not strange for us. We have built our own roads, our own schools for decades. The Serbian state does little for us, he said, referencing Albanian traditions of self-organization and local autonomy. The Imam and other local ethnically Albanian activists told us how they often drew on their own refugee experiences to defend resistance to the 2015 refugees, especially when other locals would express hostility. We would say, quote, how can you do this? Don't you remember that we all fled across these same fields? So like Sajida in Sarajevo, some Muslims in Serbia drew on transformative experiences of mobility within the wider NAM realm, as well as post-Yugoslav experiences of violent displacement as resources and inspiration for solidarity with people on the move, the vast majority of whom fled from the Muslim world.
Although these are only brief biographical sketches, fragments from a much wider history of Yugoslav non-alignment, Sajida and the Imam's accounts exemplify older forms of movement, other spatial commitments, and the solidarities that converge on the route in the post-Cold War struggles against new borders. These are the affective afterlives of the non-aligned movement and the structures of feeling this movement engendered globally.
In our conclusion to this chapter, we reflect on the effects of historical experiences and their affective sediments in the contemporary world. First, it's clear that these affective legacies are not causal in any simple sense. After all, following an initial period of welcome and solidarity, most post-Yugoslavs, including most Muslims, have responded apathetically at best and with hostility at worst to people on the move across this territory. In considering such diverse responses to people on the move, it's worth exploring the ways that the legacies of NAM in socialist Yugoslavia have ongoing and ambivalent resonances in the region, including some of the Eurocentric dimensions of Yugoslavia's role in NAM that others have noted in this conference. And we might think especially of, hierarchies of space or of development in terms of Europe in relation to the global South or the Third World. But these legacies but it's also clear that these legacies can be drawn upon as a resource that enables the imagining and creation of quite different futures. And in this chapter, we've worked to recuperate the more horizontal and even anti-colonial mobilities opened up by NAM, especially for Yugoslav Muslims. Sajida and the Imam have clearly drawn on these experiences to forge subjectivities and public actions that continue to challenge Eurocentric and colonial sensibilities and practices in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much, Maple. So it was a hotspot landing, 15 minutes. I posted in the chat a publication we have published on the migration situation of the migrants on the European border in the Balkans. So you can have a look at it. And also just for Leonor, Tina Palic was so kind to post a documentary and an exhibition on international students in Yugoslavia in the chat. So maybe there's also something helpful for you. So now I would give the word to Catherine. Yes, Catherine, please.
Thank you. Okay, first of all, since this is going out live, I just thought to correct the record in my introduction. I'm not research coordinator in our department anymore at Hull. Web team, unfortunately, haven't been able to update that yet. Everything else, however, is absolutely fine. And yeah, I'm another participant this week who couldn't contribute to the book itself because of the pressures of academic capitalism in the West. So I am very happy to have been able to be here today instead. So what I want to do is try and draw some connections between Leonora's work and then also David and Maple's. And Leonora, you're working on exchange students in Yugoslavia during the Cold War. David and Maple, you're working on Yugoslav Muslim mobilities within the non-aligned ecumene, and particularly those who were learning and using Arabic within the movement's networks of education, labour and knowledge production. And, you know, as we've just been explaining, you know, they or their children sometimes have now become geopolitical and cultural mediators again, as so many Arabic-speaking migrants and refugees have been moving through the region or being trapped in it. Now, in both these cases, language has been the connective tissue of these mobilities and the encounters that resulted from them. So, you know, David and Maple, you're dealing directly with interpreters. Leonora, you refer in your chapter to students who might have gone to Western European universities and then studied in the colonizers' languages, but started in Yugoslavia instead. So throughout the encounters that added up into the experiences in both of these chapters, language it's a skill and a resource. It's an objective of learning. It's an influence on where someone goes to exercise the international educational mobilities, which are at the heart of both these chapters. It's a means of belonging to more than one cultural sphere at the same time. It's a carrier of memory, and it's an aspect of identity, whether it's national identity, supranational, or the more so since Yugoslavia ceased to have political existence, and often also religious identity for Yugoslav Muslim learners and speakers of Arabic in particular. And I think, you know, we could still stand to see so much more research on how language and mediation between languages was the engine of non-aligned cooperation. I say this as someone who spent a lot of time researching language contacts and interpreting and translation in the context of international peacekeeping, for instance. Now, Rada, as well as Vidovana Veličković, for instance, have both written about how translation brought post-colonial and African thought into Yugoslav intellectual life. We were mentioning Biblioteka Nesvrstani Svet on Tuesday, and it may well have come up on Wednesday and Thursday when I wasn't able to listen. And, you know, linguists were among the key cultural mediators as well of, you know, non-aligned solidarities in Yugoslavia. So, you know, Petar Guberina, for instance, is one case in point, but, you know, really unlikely to have been limited to him. And yet the centre of the non-aligned world was not Yugoslavia. And David and Maple, I take your point very well, but we do need to fully decenter the Yugoslav region in connected global histories of the movement. So, you know, recognising more non-aligned mobilities out of Yugoslavia may be one good way to do that, as you're reminding us when you put Yugoslav Muslims' trans-regional educational mobility into the long durée of travel to the historical centres of Islamic learning. And Leonora indeed points to this as well by suggesting that the historiography of international student exchanges during the Cold War has Eurocentrically overemphasised Yugoslav foreign policy and the role of Tito in comparison to these exchanges' place in education policy, perhaps. Now, coloniality, in the sense of the world historical repercussions of European projects of colonisation and enslavement, which produced race as we know it, is in the background of both chapters in interesting and diffuse ways. So Leonora, for instance, contrasts Yugoslavia's welcome of African students, who made up almost a third of international students in Yugoslavia in 1962, with, for instance, racism in Belgium, where the last human exhibition was only held in 1958, or the USA, where segregated higher education was only just being challenged in the South. So we do meet here that thorny question of how international students experienced racism in Yugoslavia, which may have weighed more heavily on students who were racialized as Black than students from the Middle East and North Africa, potentially. And in your case, Leonora, you know, 3 of your interviewees were from Sub-Saharan Africa, and the others were from North Africa or the Middle East. So I was wondering, reading parts of the chapter, did you notice any difference in how they spoke about racism? And I also wondered, you know, how far can we use interviews several decades later with students who felt comfortable enough in Yugoslavia to stay there and have had decades to form their self-narratives of how they belonged or belong in the Yugoslav space? as insights into how race might have shaped the everyday experiences of international students in Yugoslavia when they were so much younger in their lives. David and Maple want to address what they call the entanglement of religion and geopolitics of the Cold War as a significant vector of soup for local and more than national belonging, I'm quoting here, beyond reducing religion into the ethnicized myopia that has dominated scholarship on the Yugoslav region. And, I think that's an important intervention there about the place of religion in our work. As you rightly argue, hardly any scholars apart from, someone like Piro Rajepi, for instance, have explored the affective histories of non-alignment for Yugoslav Muslims. And, many of us scholars who live secular lives perhaps have a lot to learn from anthropologists in accounting for the part that lived experiences of religion and faith play in the social world. Following Piro's lead, I wonder how far you could bring out or want to bring out how the repercussions of coloniality and anti-colonial struggle lived in these affective histories. So you mentioned, for instance, Safia and other Muslims gaining first-hand knowledge of the anti-colonial struggles of Palestinians, for instance. But it's striking how much the background the anti-colonial, which rhetorically was what gave non-alignment its shared history, actually seems to have been to how non-alignment was lived. Okay, I'll finish these reflections here, I think, so there's more time for discussion, but thank you again very much for giving me the opportunity to comment on both of these.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I have one question here in the chat raised by Jure Ramschek. And I'm not seeing anyone else at this moment with a question. And if this is the case, then I would maybe have an additional question, but maybe we can go to Jure's question to David and Maple.
Do you want to go first, Maple, or? You are muted.
Why don't you go first, David?
Right. How did they reconcile it? Well, we give one example straight at the beginning of the chapter in which we actually start with the Belgrade summit. And part of the Belgrade summit actually took place in the Bayrakli Mosque in Belgrade. And we translated the welcoming Friday sermon for the representatives from the Muslim majority countries who were at the summit. And what's interesting is that in the speech, and I think that's where your question about reconciliation is quite nicely kind of articulated, that the representatives of the Islamic community of Yugoslavia actually try to find the shared values of non-aligned movements such as solidarity, love, brotherhood, and so on, with basically similar values in Islamic teaching. And they were in the speeches constantly juxtaposing the two to show that there's actually no difference between them, but actually quite a significant overlap. So that would be one example how they reconcile it. Would you like to add anything, Maple?
No, I think that's great on that point. And I apologize, Catherine, you broke up for me just at the end of your question, so I didn't catch the question you posed to us at the end. So.
Sorry about that. I was asking really about the repercussions of coloniality and also anti-colonial struggle. How did they live in these kinds of affective histories of religion? You mentioned at one point, Safia and the knowledge of Palestinians' anti-colonial struggles, for instance, she was getting. And I just finished by pointing out the way in which the anti-colonial was very much part of the the rhetoric of non-alignment and its shared history and its shared meaning, you know, but was much more the background perhaps of, you know, a lot of what the lived experience of non-aligned mobility has actually meant.
Thank you.
Lerner, you have a question, and you also have a question to David and Maple. So maybe you can combine it.
Okay. I have a question about, well, thank you first for these really, really interesting, really inspiring comments, Catherine. I had the question that I got from Catherine was about how the students experienced racism, especially African students. And this is a question that I did ask in the interviews, given that I have a colleague, Peter Wright, who's worked on this specific question, and I worked a bit with him. He worked on archives especially. And it is true that in the archives, what we find is that from the little that I've seen on this question on the archives, he was kind enough to share his materials with me when we worked together. It was that you know, archives record conflict. When there's something wrong, when there's something like a conflict around race or whatever, it's in the archives, but they don't record you know, the nice things or the things that we enjoy, right? That's a part of the lived memories that we get from the interviews. That's also one of the reasons why I thought it was really important to go and interview and talk about the lived experience. So I did ask this question in every one of the interviews. And I thought you know, most of them, like actually all of them were not very, it wasn't something that came out specifically, racism. It came out through another question, which is that of women. And that was interesting, where there's like this combination, you know, like, because it's like when you were like a Black student in Yugoslavia and like you were dating a white girl, or specifically Yugoslav white girl, then like you would get these comments, you know, on race, and you would get into these conflicts. And this was like, all of them had this kind of memories when it comes to this question: how did you experience race? It was through this gender lens. So that was interesting, and I want to include that definitely in the analysis. I thought that Steve had the most interesting approach to racism, and that was taking it as a joke, and getting really into the mode of Yugoslav self-deprecating humor, which is very characteristic of Bosnian humor in particular, and you know, throwing back at them. And I had an extract that I wanted to maybe share with you on this if you have the time. Basically, it's like Steve says, yeah, one mangup, you know, asks me, like, tells me, yeah, you know, how is it, Steve, now that you are in Yugoslavia, how is it to live in a house? Because all your people there in Africa, you live in trees. And Steve says, well, you know, yeah, your ambassador used to live, your ambassador in Mombasa in Kenya, used to live on the branch just above mine. And then he says, yeah, well, afterwards, this mangup never, you know, he felt stupid and then respected him even more for answering like this. And they just laughed together. And I thought that was an interesting take on how you deal in experience with racism as well. So it doesn't have to be always this conflictual thing that you find in like archives, and that it gives a very specific vision of it, I find. It would be great to combine mine and Peter's findings with interviews and archives and do something on that future. But now I have a question and comment for David. Hope that was so. It was like, I really enjoyed discovering your paper and your work, David and Maple. I'm sorry, both of you. I thought this was really a super original angle of analysis, and I find it like religion. I mean, yeah, it's just really this vantage point that is blind point that we don't see, like somehow. And I think that maybe all of us are, you know, all of us are part of your objective analysis in a way, because in a broad sense, even though we are probably not all Muslims, we're experiencing these different effective afterlives of Yugoslavia's global non-aligned entanglement. And we should somehow maybe include this as a reflective part of the introduction to the book. I say that for Paul as an idea, but I think there's such a good point that there's a sharp contrast between effective histories and all this violent destruction of Yugoslavia and geopolitical marginalization, exclusionary politics, etc. And I also, my question is basically like, you point to the strengthening sense of belonging to Muslim community beyond national borders within the framework of like labor mobility, international education, etc. But isn't this a little bit reductive? I wonder, isn't it reductive? Because it seems to be more of a case of some kind of intersecting solidarity or identity or belonging, both Muslim religion and Yugoslav political culture, you know, bratstvo i jedinstvo, brotherhood and unity. I think you should use the original there because it's like a specific concept. And possibly also working class experience as a first time travel abroad, which you all evoke in your chapter, you know? Isn't there something specifically Yugoslav about this Muslim internationalism? That's what I'm asking. And you also use this term, like this combination of terms, like you talk about Muslim Yugoslav internationalism. So I kind of want to push you to maybe make that point more explicit in your paper. Great, thanks.
Thank you, Leonor. Now I have two hand raisings, one from Peter and one from Bojana Videkanic. So I would suggest we make these two questions by Peter and Bojana, and then coming to the end and preparing for our break before going to the last panel of this day, yeah? So Peter.
Thank you very much. This is so much outside my normal mode of study. I've been quite astonished, and it's even taught me about myself because I'd never thought in this way. But I was brought up in a family which was orientated towards Africa. I was engaging in protests against apartheid before the anti-apartheid movement was formed, because my parents were involved in the question of the Empire Games in Cardiff, and the question of the South African team being an all-white team when the best performers were black people from South Africa. I was active in something called the Movement for Colonial Freedom. I was active in the anti-nuclear movement, and I can remember the first Belgrade summit as being something of interest from my interest in what was called the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. So even within the heart of the colonial world, an individual like me comes into non-alignment as my academic interest because of the same anti-colonial and anti-Cold War attitudes that you're talking about for Africa and Asia. But if we have a truly transnational attitude, this is a feature of people in the colonial world as well. It's just a personal comment.
Thank you very much, Peter. So, Bojana?
Thanks. This is a question that comes kind of from personal experience, living in Sarajevo in the 80s. My first English teacher, who was also a really close friend of my mom's, who was a psychiatrist in Sarajevo, he's Muslim, and he went to teach English in Iraq under the exchange contracts, and he's also gay, and he fell in love with someone in Iraq, and he had to flee Iraq once they were discovered, his Iraqi boyfriend. So have you done any research on this, on like these multiplicities of Muslim experience that weren't just based on religion, because he wasn't religious in that sense. And he went to Iraq because he was He was interested in working there, and there was a lot of actually people there as well. And he was teaching, so he wasn't working in a kind of in a company or a business.
Maple, David, do you want to answer, or what would you say?
You want to go first, Maple, this time?
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think my angle of entry into this new area of research has been very quirky and particular to the research I'm doing, you know, on the Balkan route. And I've only sort of retroactively been pulled into questions of the non-aligned movement as they've intersected with the route. And in some ways, what interests me in studying the Balkan route has been the ways that it intersects with and kind of reanimates a whole series of interesting and submerged legacies of Yugoslavia, but also, you know, not only Yugoslavia, but other forms of transnational and anti-nationalist organizing and imagining. So it's been that angle that's, you know, our point of entry. So I haven't looked at questions like you're raising, Boyana, but sounds very, very interesting. Yeah, I don't know. What would you, anything else you'd want to add, David?
I haven't come across anything like that. Yeah, thanks for a question. I think it's fascinating. But the main reason is that this topic is something I discovered more by an accident as I was having a conversation with someone, and kind of led to this topic. And I realized that it's really underexplored. So at the moment, I have only fragments, and I would like to kind of explore it a little bit more, talking to various interlocutors, including possibly someone like your teacher. And the plan was actually to do it last summer, if we didn't have COVID. But I'm not surprised by your story, because I haven't heard story about someone, for example, being gay and going abroad and then coming back and so on. But I heard stories of yeah, especially people who are going to Syria, in terms of kind of comparing, having the option, for example, going to Germany or going to Syria, which again, with my kind of secular sensibilities and so on, I was wondering why you didn't go to Berlin in the 80s if you could. But Syria seemed to be, for whatever reasons, for example, more interesting option for that person for certain, for example, inclination to Sufi poetry and things like that, that they were, for example, able to study in Damascus and Aleppo, which I thought was quite an interesting sort of also sort of angle to look at. So I think there is basically quite a lot to explore that we don't really know at the moment. And I'll get in touch with you maybe later if you could tell me maybe a little bit more about your teacher, because I find it very interesting. And I don't know if I should answer quickly to Leonora. Do you want me to answer quickly to Leonora's comment, Krunoslav, or?
You can do it shortly. Why not?
Yeah, I have only one comment about this, whether we are reducing the Yugoslav experience, whether it's reductive. What we try to show in the paper, and maybe in some references more than in the paper, is that actually these educational trajectories have much older and deeper histories. They go much broader in the past and deeper than Yugoslav kind of historical context. In particular, like what Catherine mentioned, thank you, Catherine, for your comments. For example, Al-Azhar in Egypt. There are like long historical exchanges between Bosnian students and Al-Azhar. I also know that, for example, Albanian communities have long historical connections between Istanbul as a center of learning and that which kind of spans centuries basically. So in this kind of global and deeper history, you know, the Yugoslav period is a fragment in much kind of broader history of circulation of students.
Thank you very much, David.
Yeah.
Please.
No, that's good. That's good. I was just going to, yeah, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. So just shortly in the chat, there's already a very interesting discussion. So please feel free to take a look on it. And especially for Leonora, there are two questions raised by Sarah and Johanna for you. So maybe you can then in the break take a look on them. I would now say, first of all, thank you for this very interesting talks. And I would now say we can go into the break and see you all together at 5. Hello, everyone. We are back on spot. So welcome to the last part of our wonderful conference. And not to take too much time, I would like to hand over directly to Igor Stix, who will be the moderator of this last panel. Igor, please.
Hello, everyone. I'm sure it was 3 inspiring but exhausting days. And this last panel is actually intended to be a roundtable discussion. So we want to deal with, as been announced, convivialities, contradictions, and contestations of non-alignment. And I have 3 great speakers with huge amount of experience, who also 3 speakers whom I count as my friends, and I had a chance to know them and to work with them in the past. And of course, it is about the topic that is very important to me as well. And usually I refuse to be moderator when I can say certain things, but I couldn't refuse Paul. And therefore, I will try to limit my intervention and enjoy into listening our panelists today. So it's a huge honor to have Rade Ivekovic with us, my mentor and also someone who inspired me to do what I do. And it's great to have her here because she has a huge experience with the non-alignment movement and has been also a bridge builder between various worlds from Asia to Europe and to the Balkans and back and forth over her very productive career. So I would like to start, Rada, when we discussed this panel in an email, we wanted to tackle some of these issues that you raised, such as the grand narratives that came into crisis, then disappear in the 80s. The question we want to know for start is, what was the grand narrative behind the non-aligned movement? And also, what was the philosophical core, if you want, of this movement? And what really happened in the 80s? How this grand narrative was deconstructed and then lost its political force. Of course, we'll later on come to the question, what could we do about it today? So Rada, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. I want to repeat what I said to Paul, that I'm not a specialist, I'm a specimen, which means that I grew up during non-alignment as the international aspect of our lives. And not only I, but I believe other people too. In any case, in my family, my brother studied Africa and specialized in Africa. And I went to read Indian studies at university because it was the only available thing and supposedly non-aligned in Yugoslavia and in Zagreb, where I lived at that time. But the thing is that those studies in the so-called Indology in Yugoslavia were actually quite ordinary and not informed at all by the non-aligned idea and non-aligned politics. They were actually linguistic studies. We were supposed to have philosophy, but our philosophy teacher, Čedomir Veljačić, went to India and then to Ceylon and became a Buddhist monk. So we had basically linguistic studies. We then had Hindi. We had some Hindi literature with Svetozar Petrović, who was Gajo Petrovic's brother. And we had history with an Indian teacher, Professor Chand, and other visiting Indian teachers. So it took me about quite a long time, some 20 years maybe, to deconstruct or unlearn what I had learned, more than 20 years maybe, because there was in our studies of India, there was nothing, there was no political dimension at all. But it helped me a lot in any case, because at that time, then I went to India afterwards for my own doctorate. But studying Indian philosophy at that time helped me to see that there are other possibilities and other viewpoints, other possible viewpoints, right? And this was something where there was no interference with politics or with the party, the Communist Party, because they were not interested in this. So this was not at all seen as something subversive. It gave us a lot of freedom. Then there was at that time, by the end of the 60s actually, but then we reread him in the 90s when Yugoslavia was dismantled. Radomir Konstantinović with his Philosophia Palanke. This was another eye-opener for me. One was Indian philosophy, the other was Konstantinović, and he keeps to be important for me because we understood from him that we didn't have epistemological instruments to deal with the new configuration of the world where there was no more master narrative after 1989. There was no prevailing master narrative. There were competing master narratives, that is different. There were many. Another eye-opener to me was the dismantlement of Yugoslavia itself, which made me understand then that, which reminded me of the partition of India. But this was ex post, this was knowledge ex post, because when we studied the partition of India, I never thought this could happen to my country, and no one thought, right? So somehow knowledge is belated, is always belated. Another eye-opener was a very useful eye-opener was Lyotard, Jean-François Lyotard, whom I studied while I was still in Yugoslavia, because he published this book in '83, which means in advance, Le Différent. And Le Différent is a book that says it plainly, there is no master narrative anymore, no master narrative that you can rely upon. So these were, this was the end of the great dichotomies. and the dichotomy of great narratives, capitalism and socialism, vanished all of a sudden in 1989. And once it all became visible, this was when it became visible, not only did we still lack epistemological instruments to understand the change of paradigm, but we also didn't have a clue as to what to do about it. Now, the latter awareness is even more belated. It is coming out of now, out of ecological awareness as a response to the question of how to deal with climate change, how to deal with the Anthropocene. I think here in particular to Arjun Appadurai and Dipesh Chakraborty, Bruno Latour and others. What to do to save the planet, how to respond to women's general strike, which is very important, the women's general strike over the past 2 years, mainly in Latin America, but not only. Maybe I'll come back to the massa narratives in a while. Yet another eye-opener was, as I may have said already, the partitions, the two partitions of India and of Yugoslavia. Now, looking back at the 90s decade brought us some belated but useful knowledge. We must save what now pragmatically appears as useless history from oblivion. Useless history is, the expression is by Slobodan Schneider in his, one of his last two books, I don't remember anywhere which one, but he speaks of nepotrebna povijest, ironically, of course. Nepotrebna povijest, useless history, is very useful for us to learn something from it. What can you learn from loss? What can you learn from errors? We maybe also because much can be learned from experience, and also in a Benjaminian way, it may be the occasion to seize the memory of non-alignment, for example, when the time comes, as it has come now, apparently also thanks to Paul. So I see enterprises as this one as an opportunity for a new turn in epistemology, also in the sense, why not, of Boaventura de Sousa Santos, but also in our own sense. And out of my generation's political experience, my generations, because it is males from my generation that fought the last civil war, I should say that we were utterly unprepared to understand what was happening during that war, that civil war, because we had been protected by our parents' generation. They had fought World War II as anti-fascists, and they had wanted to spare us the trouble of being political subjects at all by delivering the bright future ready-made for us, right? They museified Yugoslavia, they re-Stalinized it, and I actually learned a lot from a kind of retrospective comparison with the partition of India and with other events in the world now, with the fascization of many places in the world and Europe to a great extent. At that time in the 90s, we were a group of people working on partitions compared with Indian comrades. But at the time, when as students of Indian philosophy, we had studied the partition, I wasn't aware of what was coming. However, probable nationalism was a real surprise to many of us. I analyzed it subsequently as the result, not as the cause of the partition of Yugoslavia. And as Prasenjit Dwara writes about China. Prasenjit is an Indian historian of China. And I think it is valid for Yugoslavia too. He says, I quote him briefly, "The socialist model of the civic nation state built, however rhetorically, upon the fraternity of nationalities within and socialist and third world internationalism abroad." End of the first part of the quote, which then with globalization after 1989, back to quote Prasenjit Dwara, morphed into an ethnic model. Now this ethnic model, to use his words, became a general feature of socio-political transformation in the world, it seems, since the so-called end of the so-called Cold War. But it is true that Yugoslavia and the Balkans gave the example, at least in Europe, the example after the Cold War, becoming the avant-garde of the retrograde, right? As Dubravka Stojanovic has it. Not only is the EU, the European Union, following that bad example, but we have today preposterous situations. I will spare you the details. So the years, I take them as years, not as 1 year, I say in the plural, the years 1989 put globally an end to the dichotomy of two opposed and complementary master narratives, socialism and capitalism, each with their variants. All of a sudden, we became disoriented. During the previous period of the Cold War, it was much simpler because the world had been black and white. Now, I'm not pleading here at all for neutrality or relativism between the two options, but master narratives hold as long as they are few, ideally only one, but logically two, always two, at least. So we should have known that such a world was temporary, but its interminable protraction made us believe that it would last, right? Like the interminable protraction of the agony of Yugoslavia, right? It was interminable. And the non-aligned movement was a kind of a premonition, an awesome political intuition that the dichotomy in which we are all trapped needs absolutely to be overcome, but that then we will only, or we must we must have a plurality of options and not one only script. And NAM knew it. It is only then that we would really become political. So from this point of view, if this is the narrative of NAM, the Cold War was pre-political in that sense, pre-political of a possible, in the framework of a possible NAM philosophy. I don't know whether this answers your question. I have already taken most of my time, isn't it?
Thank you very much. You are giving us a lot of food for thought, and this question of the dichotomy and having NAM as a non-aligned movement leading towards the third way, so already trying to deconstruct a bit these dichotomies, maybe could explain for the fragility but also strength of socialist Yugoslavia. Especially what you mentioned about fraternity among nationalities within the country, that of course naturally should expand towards an internationalist point of view, and how all of that was wiped out after '89, which probably accounts for the loss of relevance of the NAM in general. But now we have, so unlike yourself, who went in the 90s, moved to Paris towards West, Paul did this fatal choice of moving from the West to the East. And now I really have to ask him even a personal question, but we know that personal is never just personal. Why on earth you are now so interested in non-aligned movement? Why you organize this conference and spent this formidable energy to bring us all together? And obviously there have been like hundreds of people these days. Tell us why you got interested in this.
You would think that I would have learned now to unmute myself. So it's a great question, Igor. And I think I've now realized that actually the only reason I did all this is so that one day I could tell people I was on the same panel as Rada Ivekovic. And I do want to, you know, personally thank you, Rada, for the really close attention that you've paid to this project and to my engagement in it. And I am going to get...
It's reciprocal interest, you know, it is reciprocal interest.
And the work on translation before, this is a long story, and many people have stories. But I mean, so Igor, I've been kind of falsely constructing this rupture in my own work, you know, that suddenly I took this great historical turn a few years ago. But actually, you know, my first serious academic text in and about the post-Yugoslav space was interrogating the notion of civil society, you know, as if it had been brought in by USAID to the region, and, you know, discussing and looking at the Slovenian social movements, the way in which youth movements, communist youth actors in Slovenia were taking civil society seriously, Masnak's book, you know. So it's been a long time. And also, I mean, on Sunday, I will take part in a memorial service for Vesna Kesic, but very much, you know, Rada's generation of Yugoslav feminists teaching me that, you know, Latin America is a far more valuable comparator than Western Europe, you know. And I even, you know, when I started doing all this deconstruction of the project and projectization, it was feminist work in Latin America that was inspiring for that, in a sense. I mean, the real historical turn, I've got these books here at the side of me. So the book I edited with Rory Archer and Igor Duda on social inequalities and discontent in Yugoslav socialism, I mean, that was kind of partly my attempt to think that I was going to look much more historically at social welfare and social work. And NAM came in a little bit later. I was going to look at kind of Yugoslav contributions to social rights debates in the United Nations. I spent a month in Bielefeld where Ulrika Davy taught me how to read UN digital archives. But I realized, you know, as a scholar of globalization, as a scholar of post-coloniality, that actually other aspects of the non-aligned movement, the kind of complex contradictions, were really so important, actually. So, you know, I'm grateful to the Institute for having one of those things which are going out of fashion, a sabbatical. And of course, I tongue-in-cheek criticize historians for the fetishization of the archive. But, you know, you go to Archive Yugoslavia and you get a box and you have Tito's various iterations of Tito's speeches, you have the menu from Briuni, you know, that affective closeness to this was really, really important. So during that sabbatical, we always said, we'll talk to Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, we'll try and put together a conference that might hopefully lead to an edited book. And that conference should have happened, as I explained on Tuesday, in March last year. And if Ksenia is here, I'm sure she is. I think we hadn't even cancelled it this time last year. I remember being in the kitchen of Rosa Luxemburg in early March and realizing that we just couldn't do it because of COVID. But what we did was we just had a few kind of coffees of people that were going to present on Zoom and said we'd wait to see in September. And then September came and we really took the step that we would organize this. Must have been crazy, 4 days. And it was supposed to be light touch because we'd only have 1 hour sessions and all of this, you know. But it really did bring together the people that were going to be in Belgrade, the people that were contributing to the chapters, the people that couldn't contribute to chapters, but whose work was so important, you know. So Koli Kilabarda, who was writing about this before any of us in some ways. Catherine Baker, you know, that wonderful book that is so inspiring for so many of us in terms of bringing race and racialization back into all of this. So we, you know, we got to this, and we have most draft chapters, and we probably will end up with a book. So, you know, that's my journey in a sense. And I made a joke the other day. I was examining a PhD in Sweden, and I got an email where someone said, we would love to work with you on big data. And I said, for me, big data are the cables that Tito sent from Galeb. So I do think, you know, there are more projects around non-alignment after this, you know. One is really decentering Socialist Yugoslavia and trying to think through different nodes of the decolonial struggle, right? And the other is, of course, that whole idea following the Yugosplaining work that Aida Hodžić and Srđan Vučetić and so many other people were doing to try and think about non-alignment as an intervention in the public sphere, really. But I did promise people, and with your permission, Igor, I'll do it. On Tuesday, in my first 3-minute speech, I had my 3 slogans, and I think I want to just come back to them. So neither amnesia nor nostalgia. Well, Rada's done it better than me, but of course, the profound forgetting of the non-aligned movement, the profound forgetting even of Socialist Yugoslavia. You know, I live in a country where the TV station will not use the word Yugoslavia, all right? Is really, really important. And, you know, your lecture before the Southern Constellations exhibition in Ljubljana, where you were, I think, you know, provoking, but I think rightly so, Socialist Yugoslavia was the most successful socialist project of the 20th century. And I think, yes, in terms of scale and depth, of course, but with all the contradictions and with all the complexities of conjunctures and spatio-temporal kind of power relations and blah, blah, blah. But it wouldn't have been the most successful if it wasn't a part of this progressive internationalism, right? And so that's what's really, really interesting for me. And the second one was like, you know, this decentering and recentering Yugoslavia, but decentering it. And partly here, I want to say thank you to everybody who's run with imaginaries, you know? Imaginaries are a really interesting concept because they allow you to break down notions of macro and micro, of top down and bottom up, because everyone can have imaginaries, right? There are popular imaginaries, there are student imaginaries, there are intellectual imaginaries, there are political elite imaginaries, and they all compete with each other. But I think I just want to kind of 8 minutes, it says on my stopwatch. This Bandung Belgrade discussion and debate, I'm much less interested. No, I'm not much less interested. It is one thing to talk about the institutional continuities and discontinuities between Bandung and Belgrade, but it's quite another, I think, to talk about the imaginaries or the spirit of Bandung, combined with and in a complex agonistic relationship with the spirit of the non-aligned movement, the imaginaries of the non-aligned movement, and the tricontinental. You know, the tricontinental is really important in this because it brings Black struggles in the United States back in, and it deterritorializes the notion of the global South. And the last one was, you know, let 1,000 contradictions bloom. And, you know, for me, it is, and I guess it links to Rada's notions of the problems of meta-narrative, even as an intellectual project, right? So the idea that you bring people together who are not going to agree with each other, who are looking at different things from different perspectives with different modes of address and different modes of presentation, and actually seeing that as a much more creative space, you know, than 12 chapters that, you know, are all about the same thing using the same theory. And I'm very lucky, I think, to have found fellow travelers in this journey for that. And you know, it's been stressful, but it's been beyond my wildest expectations, I have to say. I've finished.
Thank you so much, and thank you also for bringing up that provocation or an argument I suggested at the Non-Aligned Modernities Conference in Ljubljana, and I'll tell you later on what were the answers I got by claiming that Socialist Yugoslavia was the most successful socialist project in the 20th century. Now you added something else. Yes, but it would come to nothing without progressive internationalism. Now this is the question we want to turn, and we have Boris Kanzleiter, which is someone who knows a great deal about. Many of us know Boris from Belgrade. He spent a lot of time here. He wrote a book about the student demonstration in '68. He then moved back to Berlin. Unfortunately, they took him away from us, but it's for a good cause, because now he could spread the net very, very widely across the globe as a representative for Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. And this is the question I want to ask Boris. So progressive internationalism today, why we need it and what that should be?
Yes, hello to everybody. It's really a pleasure for me to be here with you. As Igor mentioned, we had a lot of experience together, and I'm really happy to join you in this discussion. And it's really a privilege you called me for the last panel to comment on this important but also very contradictory topic of progressive internationalism today. I want to start first to thank Paul and everybody who is participating in the conference, because I'm thinking it's really very important. I'm speaking to you from Germany, from Berlin, from a core country of the European capitalism and the world capitalism, let's say. And I can tell you the discussions about colonialism, about anti-colonialism, about imperialism, about anti-imperialism are practically absent from broader public discussions, and they are also marginalized in the scientific discussion. I would even say, unfortunately, that the topics of colonialism and anti-colonialism and the history of anti-imperialism is also absent from discussions in the left movements. It's of course not completely absent, but compared with earlier decades, it is clearly a fact that the discussions, the left, at least in Germany, I think in Western Europe generally, is not anymore marked by the anti-colonial movements, which, as was rightly said, I think by Gal Kern in an earlier contribution, which shaped somehow the generation of '68. And the movement, the student movement or the protest movements, the global movement of '68. This generation of '68 is, I would say, largely entering now into the deserved pension. And the younger generation of leftists do not remember this time of the anti-colonial, the decolonization movements, the Vietnam War and so on. They are not marked by this experience. And this is, of course, also having effects on the political discourse of the left today. Even in the 90s, after the, I would say, defeat of '89, defeat in the sense of a change of political power relations in favor of global capitalism, even in the 90s, left discourse about colonialism, about the North-South relations generally, was stronger than today. I will mention the Zapatist uprising of '94, which brought this topic much to the core of discussions of the left, but also the big mobilizations against the World Trade Organizations in Seattle '99 or the Genoa 2001 G7 summit the experiences of the pink tide left governments in Latin America, the World Social Forum. Even in the 90s and in the early 2000s, I would say there was an environment in the left, also in left academic circles, which was creating discussions about North-South relationships, about colonialism, anti-colonialism. And this has largely been lost in the last decade, I would say. So there are a lot of reasons, I think, to talk about NAM. And it's certainly not a strange hobby of some historians who have, or his historian nerds, as was mentioned, who have a certain hobby glorifying some past or whatever. I think it's of utmost political importance to bring these discussions into the political discourse of the left and also of a critical academic field. Because really, when we are talking about the decolonization movements, and NAM was one of the most important political expressions and a political representation of these movements. When we are talking about these movements, we are talking effectively about one of the most important social and political emancipatory movements of the 20th century. A part of the socialist movement, the labor movement, the feminist movement, the ecology movement, I would say the anti-colonial movement, the decolonization movement was one of the most important emancipatory and progressive left movements in the 20th century. And when we are looking in what happened in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s during the liberation struggles in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, many people who don't deal with the topic are very surprised that actually the war never stopped somehow. They talk about the First World War, a Second World War, and then a period of peace, which ended somehow in a new constellation in '89. In the perspective of the tricont of the periphery of world capitalism is simply not true. It was a continuous warfare between anti-colonial movements and imperialist states and colonial rule. So looking at Algeria, for example, Algerian revolution from 59 to 62, more than 1 million victims. The killing of the Communist Party, the members of the Communist Party of Indonesia before the overthrow of the Sukarno government between 1965 and 66 took over 1 million victims, members or sympathizers or mass bases of the Communist Party of Indonesia. The war in Vietnam against the Viet Cong by the Americans, more than 1 million victims. I could go on with the liberation struggles of the national liberation movements in Central America, FSLN, FRL, and Guatemaltec guerrilla fights. These were struggles with enormous victims which are forgotten when forgetting the history and the movement. So also these victims of colonialism and world capitalism are erased from the memory. So for that reason, I think it's extremely important for the left with the internationalist orientation for critical researchers to bring this back also to the memory. So what are the maybe aspects the political meaning of the NAM for us today as a left internationalists? I would say there are two. First of all, of course, the global power relations change after '89 fundamentally, there is no socialist camp anymore. There's also not something like a non-aligned bloc for that reason also. China had a big rising as a new important also industrial power and technological power. The US and the European Union are losing political strength, but still world capitalism exists, and it's based on global inequalities. It's based on unequal exchange. It's based on extractivist politics. And it's based in that way also on neo-colonialism. So for that reason, the claim of the non-alignment movement in all its diversity for a just economic system, however this could be developed, and for full political independence and equality of nations on a world scale, this claim is still an unfulfilled promise. And I think this is the first point of relevance of NAM for today's political struggles. Second, I think, for speaking now from a left-wing political view, trying to develop political strategies also, I think the attempts of NAM to reform, to intervene in the United Nations system and to shape it in a way, is a second very important point, which is of big importance for us today. The Charter of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948 are already very progressive documents. It's really worth to read them. It's incredible what is stated in these important documents. Also, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights already contains elements of social and economic rights. It's not only about political rights. Of course, political rights are the most fundamental human rights, but already in 1948, there is a beginning of a discussion about social rights also within the United Nations system. But actually, it's the non-alignment movement, the presence of the decolonized countries inside the United Nations system, also the presence of the state socialist system, however we see them and however critical we are to the human rights record, for example, of the state socialist systems in the time. But the presence of the socialist states, and especially the presence of the decolonized states and NAM inside the United Nations system, expanded the human rights concept largely to social rights, to economic rights, to cultural rights, and also to collective rights, which are now enshrined in important documents like the International Convention on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights of 1966, like the Declaration on Decolonization already of 1916, but also the Declaration of the New International Economic Order from 1974, and many, many other declarations which are important cornerstones for an international system which is based on human rights, on social and economic rights, and the right of every people for self-determination and for economic development, however this is practically conceived. This is, I think, for left-wing politics, a very important achievement and a very important possibility to draft also strategies. The problem now, and I'm coming to the end, don't worry. The problem now is, of course, that the left today on a world scale is not, there are not many left governments, let's say. And the United Nations system is, of course, fundamentally an intergovernmental system or interstate system. Except a small number of countries, we do not have a progressive or left government. So the potential of the United Nations system for left politics, for that reason, is not, of course, used, and maybe also not really so much part of strategic discussions for the international left. But I think the potential is of course there, and it's very important that we also investigate and research more about this history. So if we do not have left governments anymore, or only a very small number of left governments worldwide, how can we then conceive and develop a left internationalist, progressive internationalist politics and movements? I think here NAM also can give us some ideas. It was already mentioned, the idea of plurality, the idea of a world consisting of different worlds is, of course, of a core importance for left internationalist politics. We are living in a political crisis, and I think we are now rather in a position of the founders of the first international, which came together in Geneva in 1866 to found the International Workingmen's Association as a federation of very different actors coming from very different political traditions or backgrounds to form something like a transnational network in order to push forward a progressive agenda. If we see internationalism like that we are back practically in the period before socialist statehood existed, then NAM can be an inspiration for a number of these struggles. But of course, when we are talking about NAM today, we are also talking about history. Thank you.
Thank you, Boris. Definitely, so many things we're going to go back to. Now it's 5:45, and I'm tempted, of course, to continue for another round, but I'm tempted also to open up the floor for questions, because I'm sure there's so many people who want to ask questions. I have so many, and I'm sure many of you have. And okay, raising hands. I saw some. I saw hand, and I'll try to get you in. I hope it will show me. Yes. So Peter, please. We will collect the questions, 2 or 3 questions, and then, or 4, and then we'll go back to the speakers. Sir, go ahead.
Sorry. I think I've been developing on a pragmatic basis, as I reflect on current politics, a very, very different sort of idea that anti-colonialism was not a goal for the left. It was a means to a goal. So if we want a world with political equality, economic equality, social equality, then it is impossible in a world of empires. But to break up those empires does in itself nothing to achieve the goals of the left. The question is then, what do these new political structures do with the freedom they've gained to act independently of the colonial metropole? Now, my second point is that I think the nature of fascism has changed. But if you take the origin of the word fasces, that it is a process of binding together groups of people within society, with the emphasis on leadership binding people together, but also the emphasis on groups and the denial of individualism, then to me, identity politics is liberal fascism. It's not oppressive fascism in the sense of killing people, torturing people, etc. But if we look at British politics, to me, people like Blair, Cameron, Johnson, Corbyn are people who do not stand for any ideals of equality, do not stand for capitalism versus socialism. They simply stand for a pragmatic muddle through, but a focus on their leadership and the importance of their leadership, no ideological discussion, and bowing to identity politics within Britain. Now, if we want to sort of reject the accusation that I'm somehow a new form of colonial thinker, I would take up our commentator earlier seemed to be suggesting the idea of racism is something to be challenged. That why does race exist? It only exists as an intellectual idea, reality, as an idea to legitimize slavery. The concept of racism, I do not believe, existed substantially before slavery. And the idea that there is a biological race to the nature of biology. You know, the differences of skin color or hair or physique are trivial, absolutely trivial biologically. And we see it in the current debate in Britain about COVID, that people have been insistent that there must be a difference in the death rate amongst people of color.
Peter, I'm sorry,
based on ethnicity, for biological reasons.
Peter, I'm probably the third oldest white man from Britain in the room, but I kind of feel like this space is more precious than listening just to one person on this. I mean, we can talk about the materiality of race for a long time, it seems to me. But I don't think British identity politics is the, you know, says the white man, the third oldest white man from Britain in the room, the kind of topic of this. Now, I know it's an...
Oh, sorry, but I would apply it to all other countries in the world. It applies to Trumpism. It applies to dictatorships in developing countries. But they assert a sort of identity.
Do you have any other quick comment or question? I guess you should raise your hand. Okay, let's keep these questions in mind, but also I would like to go back now to Rada. It was very dramatic to hear you speak about unpreparedness for what was to come in the 80s. So in a way that, if I understood it correctly, that we were not capable epistemologically to understand what is going on, and therefore could not develop political tools to fight what was there around the corner. But of course, it was one of the possibilities, historical possibilities that did happen. And of course, you mentioned this work throughout the 90s. I would say in the shadow of the whole media rhetoric on identity politics and ethnic wars and so on. Many of people who are here in the room deconstructed it, but there was a lot to work, and you went to work with Indians, and you went to work with people in Israel and Palestine. And I remember when I came to Paris to your seminar, there were people there who introduced us into basically fitting this Yugoslav example within the wider processes. Now, the question I want to ask is, do you think that now we have these epistemological tools? Do we really understand what is going on? And does this, can this give us also political leverage? Yes, unmute. Not yet.
Okay, excuse me.
Now,
thank you for your question, Igor. The thing is that it is not something that applies only to us from former Yugoslavia or to us who are interested in NAM. This is a feature of what we now call globalization. And it works generally on the planet now for everyone, I'm afraid to say. So I think we now understand better the mechanisms of it all, but I don't think that we shall ever go back to a situation of epistemological certainties, right? We need to work and stay within a configuration of a complete uncertainty and therefore openness also, because we need to be open to other narratives. And there is no telling us in advance now which narrative is progressive and which one is regressive or fascist. You have seen, everyone here has seen all the debates about populism lately in Europe and elsewhere, and the debate between left and right, so-called left and so-called right populism. It is an unending story, but we must go through all of this. In this sense, NAM was positive for two reasons. One is it disturbed and actively deconstructed the Cold War dichotomy. And the other thing is it introduced the bug of plurality and of possibility of different options and perspectives. And this second feature was its well-known inner contradiction and inconsistency. For example, the fact that countries of all political systems were part of NAM, which we thought was ridiculous even at that time. But retrospectively, we can see that there was a kind of epistemologically hidden reason to it. If there are to be many narratives, then we need to deal with them. But no script will be given in advance. Therefore, NAM was never actually a master narrative.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It cannot be a master narrative, although we would love it to be. I would love it to be a master narrative. But I can say on the side, non-master narratives. NAM was a prop narrative for the progressive, socialist, and so on. Master narrative, but on the side of it, we need to understand that any narrative, even a small narrative, it was say NAM was the philosophy of NAM was not a grand narrative, but a smaller, minor narrative, but we need to understand that these disturbing inner elements are absolutely constitutive. And this is why also we have a problem with the tendency of NAM to be politically, we have a logical problem, maybe not substantial, but a logical problem of the tendency of NAM to be politically nearer to the progressive or the socialist camp. In principle, we would have to accept it not to have been it. And it hasn't been it. There were, I don't know, the Shah of Iran was a member of, Iran was a member at the time of the Shah, and Tito traveled to some celebration of I don't know how many centuries of the existence of Persia. So this was a greater but not a great narrative, and we have to be happy with it. I don't see another possibility. I don't know what you think. What do you think, Igor?
Well, I think it's good to bring this in, so not to see it only through the desired lenses as necessarily progressive, but it was clearly the framework within which it was possible to push the anti-colonial agenda, and also to give voices to these deconstructing narratives within the two master narratives. I wonder what would in these final comments, what would Paul, because Paul, this is your last chance to speak. I know that there is a chat also a program for 1st of March, but that's unofficial. Now officially this year, since you are our sort of, I don't know, you're a double agent or whatever, but we also use you to to promote our cause. Because, you know, when we former Yugoslav go somewhere and we speak about what we see in the European Union, now it's all reminders of Yugoslavia, and we all go back, and people are just after 5 minutes cannot really listen to us because they think we are biased, because they think we want to make our story greater than it really is. Now, why would you say, how would you convince someone that the legacy of now, which we all now agree is, it seems agree that it's extraordinary important, why should we care? Why should anyone? I mean, we mentioned the case of Great Britain, which also, of course, we could open up, and it has many parallels with. Now, why would this be important for anyone? I mean, as we know, so many people don't even know about the existence of this movement these days.
Yeah. So thanks, Igor. I mean, two almost contradictory answers to your question, because they work at very different registers. And I think, you know, again, it's when Rada talks about the absence of meta-narratives. I mean, NAM was a flexible hybrid of a movement and an organization before notions of hybridity, flexibility, were conceived of, you know. And, you know, even when I talk about Yugoslavia's liminal hegemony of the movement, you know, this was a conscious and a reflexive liminal hegemony. It's like, what right do we have to be actually steering the agenda so much here? And, you know, so you've got this very complicated set of deeply political, deeply courageous support for liberation movements, at the same time as the idea that every summit should succeed because there should not be any kind of internal conflicts demonstrated. You should have de-ideologization and so on and so forth. So, I mean, and Gal and I and you, I think, have had lots of these conversations about what if, you know, what if Yugoslavia had continued to manage to both implement a state and an internationalist project of policy, whilst also really being responsive to agonistic alternatives, you know, and that didn't happen. You know, when did that stop happening is a complicated conjunctural and political question, it seems to me. But I think, you know, that's the first point. But the second is very much Boris's, you know. And Dubravka Sekulic said it on the first day. The UN is the global bourgeois public sphere. All right. We never managed to abolish the Security Council. We never managed to really, you know, make it beyond states. And, you know, this is probably not even relevant, really. But immediately after this, I spent the weekend with Zagreb Jenash, trying to finish our program for the local elections in Zagreb. And I've said this on too many occasions, you know, the Westphalian bourgeois nation state isn't just a problem because it's Westphalian and bourgeois. It is both far too small to be an actor because you need transnational movements. But it's far too large to be an actor because it's not where people live their lives. You know, I live my life in a building and worry about COVID and earthquakes with my neighbors. And, you know, Benedict Anderson's right in those fascist use of imaginaries, right? Once you have a nation state, I can't know all the 4.2 million people in Croatia, and therefore it lends itself to that nationalist tendency that Rada spoke about. And therefore, you know, I wrote in the chat one day that it would be good to look at how, you know, did the Republic key, did the kind of decentralization of Yugoslavia actually manifest itself within the non-aligned movement? In my introductory chapter, via some work by Dejan Jovic, I kind of argue that this was Tito's baby because he was marginalized from some of the decision making in the central state. Now that's probably going far too far, but you know, this kind of almost what's the word? What is it when you give contracts to outsourcing of the non-aligned movement to a particular federal body that had no real power within Yugoslavia strikes me as a fascinating kind of issue. I've finished, as they say.
Mm-hmm. We have two more questions. There's Bojana Videkanic and Gordana Jovanovic. So short questions, comments, and then probably we'll channel them to some of the speakers. But we also want to hear Boris. Yes, Bojana.
I think Gordana was before me.
Okay, thank you very much for this conference. I'm in Belgrade. I'm a psychologist, but I'm not a loyal psychologist. I'm proud of not being a loyal psychologist. I had the privilege to live in Socialist Yugoslavia, and I have also a tragedy of losing Socialist project and losing Yugoslavia. So, but now, my question, I have concerns regarding epistemological issues addressed by Rada, but also by other participants. In the last decades, we have witnessed flourishing of discourses on differences. And it has been understood as a way of emancipation from the repression of the universal, of global. But I see quite serious problems in that, because of course, the way how we conceptualize phenomena draws our attention to some aspects and away from some other aspects. And then if we are so much focused on differences, I don't know how is it possible then to build something common which society presupposes. And then there's a lot of discussion of othering. Othering means to understand the other so much different from me that there is nothing common. So I think one of epistemological tasks, in my view, would be to work toward looking and building something which is common to all human beings. Otherwise, we will be lost, as we are already, I think, in so many fragments, in fragmented knowledge, in fragmented societies, and then in the world falling apart. So I would be interested, how would you respond to my concerns? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gordana. Rado, you want to
answer Gordana's question? Thank you for your question, Gordana. You see, whatever we do in whichever field, we need to take it from above and also from below, which means that we need to act at the same time at the universal level and at the particular level. Otherwise, it doesn't work at all. Otherwise, we shall be fooled. And it has happened so many times in history, you know. For example, the famous slogan in the, I don't know when, in the 60s or 70s or something, Vive la différence, long live difference. This can be a fascist slogan, And it can also be a progressive slogan for those who need to struggle for their own perspective. This is why the question you ask, whether from this side or from that side, for me is not the good question. But I understand you asking about it. We always need to look at both registers, right? We have another way of approaching this question today. We can ask ourselves, where do the knowledges in the plural, spell check doesn't take the plural of knowledge, but knowledges are plural. Where do they come from? They don't come anymore only from universities. They don't come from the north to the south of the planet only, or from west to east. They actually come from all directions. They come from political experience. They come from life itself. They come from sharing. And this is where we have in each particular case to work out a solution for the question. I would never give up the universal aspect of whatever is of any human claims. But I have seen groups in the past, the feminist groups and others, who have given it up and have ended up in ethnicism or gender focusing, very straight gender focusing. Actually, if you don't want to give up the universal aspect, you need also to take into account the particular aspects. The universal is made of so many particular elements, right? But therefore, we can't have an answer in advance. And we have to accept it. It's very uncomfortable. Thinking is very uncomfortable today. There is no script, and we need to accept not to be sure or certain about what we are doing. This is also one of the reasons why teachers at university have no authority anymore, because we can't give ready-made answers. And it actually pervades all the aspects of our lives, but it is an epistemological question. We need to keep it open. Thank you for your question.
If I can add just a sentence, of course, we need something common in order to make communication possible, in order to make possible understanding each other. Without that, this is not possible. So from that reason, I raised that question. Of course, I don't want to neglect differences.
Sure, I understood that. Thank you.
Bojana, that's the last question before I give floor to also to Boris and Paul to conclude.
So just maybe a comment or a question or something to think about is that something that Paul has mentioned earlier about centering and decentering Yugoslavia. This conference, if we look at our structure of the conference, is mostly made of people who are writing and working on Yugoslavia. So of course, in a context of a conference such as this one, Yugoslavia is central. But of course, NAM, as we've been trying to say, is much larger than that. And to me, and Paul, I said this to you earlier in our sort of preliminary meetings, it is absolutely necessary and essential to bring colleagues from other NAM countries to. So this dialogue would have looked very, very differently if for example, on our panel on art. We've had my colleague Sanjukta Sundarson, who is working on India. So, you know, her perspective, for example, on partisans. Her book is called Partisan. It has partisans in the, and she was laughing to me and said, you know, when this book came out, I had to explain why it's not Yugoslavia, why it's not Yugoslav partisans. So we're just laughing at that. But of course, in our research, common research, there's a lot. And she's very interested in Yugoslavia because on her end, in Asia, there is no discussion of Yugoslavia. So of course, from our very limited perspective, it all looks very central, but look at the makeup of this conference. So it is absolutely then necessary to break away from the insularity and create international collective work on this.
These are the next steps, I'm sure. But to all the Indian friends to whom I sent the information about this webinar never turned up on it.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is also an issue because when I speak about Yugoslavia, everybody looks at me like, what? What are you talking about? So this is the importance of actually promoting this research because other colleagues have no knowledge of it as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm working on something for September, which is about sorry.
I will keep this question so you can think about it because that would be the last, so your intervention to tell us what is yet to come. But I would like also to give opportunity to Boris to actually respond to this very important question that's been raised, which is between universal and particular, which is between general issues that are global, and Peter Willets also wrote something along these lines, that are truly global and that the left should care about, and the reality that is very particular for the greatest number of human beings, meaning either reality of a particular state, or particular region, or particular city. So since you've been going all the way across the globe, meeting people, trying to fight the very particular situations, so there's a lot of misunderstanding and non-understanding here. How would you, Boris, respond to this clash of the global issues that the left, of course, cares about and the very particular fragmented realities?
Unfortunately, I'm not traveling a lot in recent times. I'm actually sitting in the last year here in Berlin. I think we have all the same problem. Although our organization has 26 regional offices worldwide, the office in Belgrade is one of 26 offices. We are operating offices from China, from Peking to Sao Paulo, and from New York to Johannesburg. Before I answer or try to answer a bit your question, I would continue with the little discussion about which other topics we should maybe debate about also. I think Paul already mentioned that NAM is of course one of different expressions and representations and political organizations of the decolonization movement. There are others which were linked or related to NAM but have their own political context, their own political orientation also, like for example the Tricontinental Conference in La Habana in 1967, I think it was constituted, and Che Guevara held his famous speech about creating 1, 2, 3 Vietnams as at this conference, which was let's say the militant left wing, also linked to armed struggles, wing of the NAM movement in a way. There was partly actors were participating in NAM, but the Tricontinental Conference had its own political and strategical context. I think that would be also very important to develop research on the linkages between and also the differences and so on. Another topic is the Baku Conference of the Peoples of the East of the Communist International in 1921. There was recently the 100th, 1920 actually, the 100th anniversary. it was the intent of the Communist International practically to develop something like an anti-colonialist or politics of national liberation. Very important also debates, which also take up exactly the discussions we are also having in the context of talking about the NAM. Also important, I think, is the Algerian Revolution, also largely forgotten because of the civil war in Algeria in the 90s and the whole collapse of the whole society in Algeria. But Algeria was the center of the world revolution in a way in the beginning of the 60s. With the presence of the Black Panther Party in Algeria, with the presence of many other liberation movements, also linked, of course, to NAM in a way. All these different examples illustrate that there are so many different like contexts, actors, networks of anti-colonial struggles in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I think it's really time to focus more in research about these networks. And for that reason, I think also this conference is really important, but only a start also for bringing this political experience back to also a public memory and also, of course, to research. So the big question, which is, I think, core questions also for left politics generally, the universal and the particular. I think many things about that were already mentioned and said now by Rada. In my opinion, I think a left, emancipatory left, is developing its political ideology and also its political strategies on the ground of the idea of universal emancipation. Universal emancipation, which is at the core also of the early Marxism. If you read the early texts of Marx before he focused on political economy, you have these philosophical texts about the emancipation of the human being, the idea of universal emancipation of every human being. This was inspiring also for the Praxis discourse in Yugoslavia, of the Praxis group and cultural disreception of the early works of Marx. But I think in terms of our view, what a human being is and should be, and which possibilities a human being should have, I think this is core. This is the core essence of our political idea, the universal emancipation. Everybody is born equal in rights and should have also the possibility to develop its potentials, and in an association of free individuals in a free society. So this is universal emancipation, in my opinion, containing political freedoms and rights and social rights, and also the right to live sexual orientation or whatever a human being wants to express in a way a human being wants to do it. So this is an idea of a liberated society, and this is a universal idea. Unfortunately, capitalism and all class societies are defining the social position of every human being. Gender, race, social class, belonging are defining our possibilities to develop as a human being. And they are restricting us as a human beings to develop freely. For that reason, and some groups are more obstructed and repressed than other groups. And this has to do with a class system and a gendered also relation in a class society, and also a race system in a class society. So for that reason, I think identity politics are necessary actually, but not to only affirm a certain specificity and to essentialize, in German it's Essentialisierung, essentialize this identity as the only point of reference. But identity politics are necessary to form political consciousness and power positions in a class society, to emancipate one as a group also. But in the perspective of the universal emancipation. So I think it's not also, it's not in contradiction. Left emancipatory identity politics is transforming society in the direction of a universal emancipated society. In that way, it's not a contradiction.
Thank you, Boris. And now at the end, the poll about next steps and also how to include other scholars from other non-aligned movement country, ex-non-aligned movement countries.
Yeah, I mean, there's some lovely stuff going on in the chat. I mean, I'm not really, and thanks, Aida, yes, we're discussing, there's lots of stuff going on. This is only 4 days of 2 hours a day, you know, there's lots of other spaces. So that's a footnote, really, that sounds probably more defensive than it's meant to. But if I were to visualize this, then the space in which we're trying to engage is a network of networks with complicating, shifting nodes and relations, right? Bear with me. Some of these become more important depending on what's been talked about, when it's been talked about, and so on and so forth, right? Now, you then have, and it's almost like the Zoom spotlight thing, you can either spotlight one of the nodes and bring together people, and I've written it down when people were talking. So you find the transnational and the universal through a forgotten particular, or through a particular that has been erased from history, namely Socialist Yugoslavia. Now that gives you something, but it doesn't give you everything, either intellectually, nor of course emancipatorily, far from it, right? The other thing you can do, of course, is go upwards and shine a beam over all of those nodes and have people from all of the places, in a sense. And I'm working on that for September. There's an attempt to do this as a kind of intervention globally around some of these things, but I don't regret, I think, kind of bringing, you know, getting this scholarship and these people together. And the two best books that I'm reading at the moment are absolutely Sundaresan's Partisan Aesthetics, you know, and Gal and Sanjukta need to get together. And Sarah Salem's book on Egypt, where she brings Fanon and Gramsci together in really extraordinary and interesting ways. So you know how to think through it, Aida, absolutely. How to think through this tension between focusing on a node or trying to focus on lots of nodes and bringing those together is, I think, you know, it is exactly the double movement of recentering and decentering, which we have to continuously do across all of these spaces and practices, it seems to me. Yeah, so that was an intellectual response. Well, intellectual, it was cognitive.
Thank you all. Thank you all for participating. This was an incredible panel. What a 4 days. And of course, as Rada said, thinking is uncomfortable, but I guess we have no other choice. Let that sink in. Bye-bye, everyone.
So just before they turn off, I did have the thanks. And they are, firstly, to Marilia Puda, who's actually not that well today, but has been managing the technology of this superbly. So thank you so much, Marilia. Ksenia, Yelena, and Kruno for moderating. So good. Jelena, when none of us could get in the Zoom room on Wednesday, was the epitome of calm. And I'm going to have to try and learn some of that as I get into early middle age. Thank you to all the presenters. Thank you so much to the commentators. Thanks so much to the participants. We got to, I think, 134 at one point. This will only make sense to scholars of the Yugoslav space, but one moment yesterday, Boris Budin and Budimir Lončar were in the same Zoom room. And it just seems, that's not a bad thing to be able to take and tell my kids. So thanks.